All right, everybody, looks like we are live. Welcome. My name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network, where we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, not 7:30 as it was scheduled earlier today. So I apologize for any confusion about the timing. There was as mentioned in the chat, there was a bit of a glitch about the timing. So I'm glad you're all here to join me today. This is what we're working on today. This is a landscape here. This is tunnel view from Yosemite. I've never been there, but this is one of those iconic views looking down the valley there. Focusing today on atmosphere. So really creating that sense of depth, controlling contrast, so lowering the contrast as we recede, increasing the contrast as we advance, as well as kind of managing details, things like that, because the goal here is to create this sense of space and atmosphere. So in the search for reference images, I really wanted to focus on something that had atmosphere, fog, clouds, things like that, that can help us really address kind of issues of subtlety and value. And I came across this and I thought it'd be perfect. So that's what we're working on today. Let's see, if you want to follow along, you can find the reference image in the description below. So you can bring that up. I have a nice big image. That's the one that's right below me here. I am working on a small piece of, this is the Stonehenge Pearl Gray. So Legion sent me out some paper. I love this paper. It is awesome to work with. This is a Pearl Gray, and it's a little light in value. Some of the gray tone paper we've used in the past is a little bit darker. So just to give you a context of its tone, if we put the sheet of white paper on it, you can see that it's knocked down a little bit. It's a little bit more gray, and it also has a nice warmth to it that I thought worked really well with this scene. There's just the way the light fills the landscape here has a warmth to it. This is really awesome. This is a cotton rag paper, so similar to what we used last week with the Rives BFK. It's got a nice smooth surface, but it's not slick, and so it'll hold the charcoal really well. In this case, actually graphite and charcoal combined. So looking at some of the materials, I chose graphite for this, again, because there's just kind of a lightness to the scene. There's a kind of a shimmering quality to it that I thought graphite might be more appropriate for. So I have a B and an F of these Derwents. They're really kind of my middle. These are going to be my light tones. And then I have this Onyx, which is a dark one. So this gives me a nice full range. If you don't have a dark like this, if you get like a 6B, 4B, it's probably going to get you as dark as you need to get for this. And then for these light tones, they're a little bit darker perhaps because I'm trying to compensate for the camera here. So I want things to show up. So you might try something that's even a little bit lighter. So you don't have to have the exact materials I do as long as it's kind of a range that you can work within. I've got my trusty blending stump. We're going to be using that a bunch today. I have also a charcoal white. This is a General's charcoal white pencil to add the lights to it. So I'm kind of mixing the graphite and the charcoal, which many times doesn't work because the graphite makes the surface pretty slick. And so the charcoal will often not grab onto that if we layer it on top. So we just have to be careful with how we use these together to make sure that they work. I have a retractable rubber eraser here that I'll be using for some of the sharper details, and I have my trusty kneaded eraser. So actually I'll be using this a bit more probably. When I did my preparatory drawing, I ended up using it quite a bit to kind of smudge and really kind of push the subtleties. So a lot of what you're going to be seeing here today, the changes throughout the drawing are going to be pretty minor in many cases. And so, but that's what we're kind of going for, is really trying to dial in those value relationships to create something that not necessarily looks exactly like the reference photo, but creates that sense of space and atmosphere. So maybe making some editorial decisions to help increase that. So for example, with that background, here really utilizing more of that natural tone of the paper, which is a little bit lighter than maybe what we're seeing in the reference image. So all right, so let's get to it. I love seeing everybody chatting where they're viewing from. I saw somebody, Colette, welcome from Greeley. I'm not far from there at all, outside of Longmont, so I like to see all the fellow Coloradoans. And again, love seeing where everybody is viewing from. I see so many familiar names here, people from all over the world. It makes this such an awesome experience. So really what our goal here today is just to have fun drawing, share our experiences. So as you're following along, if you want to let us know how things are going, are you stuck in a certain area, do you have any questions for me or anybody in the group, you don't have to use the same material. So if you're using something different, how is that going for you? And then when you're done, you'll find that link. It's in the description below, and I pinned it to the chat where you can share your work. So it's been awesome seeing, especially the cheetah we did. There's some great drawings there. So thank you all for sharing those. All right, let's get to it. One of the things we talk about, I'm kind of orienting my thoughts right now, but one of the things we talk about a lot in this series is the idea of our brain calibrating to certain values. And that happens a lot, especially with toned paper. So what can happen with the toned paper is, as we start drawing, our brain will start to kind of adjust the values in our minds. We'll start to see this as white, as the lightest light as being white, and our marks as essentially being the darkest darks. And so we have to start kind of anticipating things. I know they're going to be adding the white, and I'm going to be adding subsequent layers of graphite, making them increasingly darker. So as I go through, I need to kind of anticipate what's going to happen, and not make value decisions based on the way my brain is calibrating to this toned paper. Its goal is to see this as white, and it's going to then change our interpretation of the precise value there. So as we start to layer on these values, it's going to recalibrate. We're going to create a new context for those values, and we'll really be able to see the true tone of the paper. So if that is completely confusing, hopefully it'll make sense throughout the drawing. But again, I just want to kind of create that sense of expectation as we go through. All right, so I'm going to grab kind of my mid-range graphite. Now, the B and the F are very close to one another in the range of values. And I don't typically kind of nitpick between specific pencils if they're close together like this. I like to think of essentially buckets of hardnesses with a graphite. So I might have like the high H's, maybe a 6 or 7, 8 or something like that might be one bucket. The 2, 3, and 4 H would be another kind of harder kind of tone. And then the F, the B's, the H's are kind of mid-tones. And they're so subtle in between, I kind of interchange them. So that's the way I kind of conceive of this. The B and the F are pretty close to one another. And so I'll just kind of use them interchangeably, and then I'll just jump to a dark when I need that. So just so you have some kind of context for those decisions. Because sometimes if you try to think that a very specific graphite needs to be used at a specific layer, that can sometimes add a layer of thought that slows everything down. So I don't want that. I need to, hello from everybody from all over. All right. Questions. If you have any questions, if you could type them out in all caps, that can be helpful just so I can see them more easily. So sometimes sometimes the chat gets a little full and I miss some important questions. If I do miss a question and you really want me to answer and I don't answer it, please be sure to repeat it. It just means that I missed it. So I definitely don't like to ignore anybody here. So all right, what do I want to do now? Generally with a landscape, I work from the background forward, but because of the nature of this scene, where I'm going to be adding the lights using the white charcoal, what I'm going to do is actually going to start in the middle. So start in that kind of middle ground, this large formation on the right, that large cliff on the left, looking straight down, and Half Dome will be kind of at the end there. So I'm going to start with that middle ground. And that's really going to anchor the composition. So my first attempt is all about just getting marks on the page. And it's all very light, but hopefully it's dark enough to see. It's all very light for me as well. But I've been working on the various exposure settings to try to make everything a little bit more readable, especially in these early stages where everything is so light it can sometimes look like I'm not really doing anything. So with this initial gesture, it's all about getting information on the page early, quick, kind of reacting to the forms, getting information on the page, so then I have something very specific to react to. So I can make decisions in the context of the drawing. I can say this needs to be larger or smaller, lighter, darker, things like that. This also kind of gets us to the point of where we start to see in our head what the scene could be. If I start by finishing a spot and then moving on, finishing another spot, I run the risk of things not quite fitting together well. So I want to build everything all up in context. So try to work the whole drawing as much as possible. So in a way, this is a bit of a kind of a notan. Notan is it's a way of conceiving of the composition by breaking it down into major shapes of light and dark. So thinking of the middle ground and that foreground as one shape, that background, those distant mountains in the sky as another shape, and then dividing that up. So I'm using this overhand grip because it really helps me to create lighter marks on the page. When the side of the pencil is engaged, it scrapes across the surface a little bit more. If I switch to a tripod grip and I use the tip of the pencil, it's going to create an embossed line, and that might be useful later on in the drawing, but at this early stage, I'm not confident where everything is placed, so I don't want an embossed line that I'm going to have to contend with later. So consider using the side of the pencil, and I'm holding it really far back right now because I don't want there to be a lot of pressure, and it also helps me to use that side. And I've carved back the core of the pencil. So I've taken a razor blade and I've shaped away the casing to expose the core a bit more so that I can really create more of a broad mark. So for anybody who's been with the show, we talk about that a lot. So it's all old news to you, but for somebody new joining the show, perhaps that kind of gives you a basic understanding of what we're thinking about there. All right. So just thinking about basic shapes here, reacting to the form. And what I love about this paper is that it really releases the material well. We talk about that a bit when working with charcoal, is that you want to pay attention to how it grabs the material as well as how it releases it with the eraser. And so right away I'm seeing some issues with the composition and the basic proportion. So now that I have, you can see this kind of ghostly outline of the major forms, I can start to make some specific decisions. And I think what I want to do is first place these verticals that are on the left and the right, these elements. I want to place them properly. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Sorry, just reading through the chat, making sure I'm not missing anything. So if you have any questions, that's what we're all here for. And as well, everybody here is really helpful at pointing out things that I can work on in my own drawing. That's why we're drawing together, is you all have helped me through some trouble spots, and that's what we're here for. So if you're new and you hear people saying, hey, this is wrong, I'm asking for that. So I'm asking for people to do that. Okay, so angle sighting, comparative measuring, plumb lines, and horizontal guides. So those of you who have been with the show know all of those terms, because we use those pretty much for every drawing, right? So every drawing kind of essentially follows a similar progression in our decision making, starting with a gesture, correcting using those tools I just described, and then building up into a level of finish and kind of really dialing that into where you're comfortable. So what I'm going to do now that I have these major forms in is, I think the first thing I want to do is actually use some comparative measuring. So what that means is I'm going to close one eye, hold my pencil up in front of the reference image, so that's up here on my left. I'm aligning this end of the pencil, I don't know if I can do that here, so this end of the pencil here with this edge of that main formation on the right. So I'm aligning it on this side, sliding my finger down the length of the pencil until it aligns with the edge of the paper, and that gives me a unit of width for that basic element. Then I'm going to bring that over and I'm going to compare that to this gap here. And what that does is, what I determine is that this distance here, if I carry that over, that actually works out just about right. That puts me at the edge of the far right of this formation over here. And then, let's see, where do I measure next? If I take that measurement, come across here, and I take one step further, it should just about cut this cliff here in half. So we're pretty close actually to that. So I'm going to kind of lock in these marks here to indicate the right side of this left structure, and then the left side of the right hand structure. Now I'm going to use that to compare to the height. I'm going to take that same measurement, and what's kind of nice is that this distance here is equivalent to its height, that main form of the height. So does that seem right? Something seems a bit off right there. Let me go with it. So now I'm going to kind of block in these major forms. This is all the kind of the correction phase. So if I take this width here, that gives me the height. So roughly that line of trees. And now let me compare that basic unit to the height. So this unit here, compare that to the height across here, and then this is a bit taller, about a fraction of a unit taller here. So what we're doing is we're really just we're gathering information about the subject, right? So we're starting from an understanding that our initial reaction is just that. It's just an initial reaction. We understand it instantly that this is a landscape, and if we're familiar with Yosemite, we can identify the specific location. But we haven't, what our brain has done for us is it's taken all that information, everything we know about it, and in a split second has sent to our conscious mind an understanding of the landscape. What we're doing throughout the drawing process is we're taking that split-second understanding and we're really digging into it. So we're going to take 2 hours drawing along and really kind of analyzing the subject to understand how did we get to that point? What are the values, the shapes, the textures, all of those things that our brain interpreted instantly, and how do we dig into that and recreate that on the page? So we want our drawing process to parallel that evolution of our understanding. And I'm saying that because, at least for me, when I started to interpret the drawing process in that way, it started to take off some pressure for me to kind of execute on the drawings right away. Sometimes it can feel like, we take that glance, we understand the landscape, we know what that is, and then we just focus and we draw without ever looking back at the subject. We think that we should be able to just draw from that initial understanding, but it's hard to really do that with the limited information our conscious mind really has about it. So if you kind of take the pressure off of yourself to understand it instantly and recognize that the drawing process is all about slowing things down and really taking your time to understand the subject, then you can kind of be a little bit more free to kind of move things around, make mistakes, correct things on the page. So I'm kind of roughing in this middle ground. So this is actually going to eventually be the tone of the paper. So I'm going to actually erase this out, but I want to give myself an orientation point so that I can see where I'm at. And at this point, I'm trying to trying to treat any of these curves as a sequence of short straight marks, to use average angles that rather than as curves. So what I've done here, that feels too large. Okay, so we've worked with some comparative measuring. At this stage, we can also add some angle sighting. So find the average angles of these forms, and we start to kind of dial that in before we add any details and all these individual notches and things like that. So to help with that, it's a similar process to comparative measuring. So hold your pencil out, close one eye, that flattens your depth perception, places that pencil visually directly on top of those edges. Align it with an angle in your scene. And if you have, especially if you have your reference image and your drawing side by side, this gets really easy. You lock your wrist, find the angle, and place it directly on top of your drawing. So in this case, on this camera, the one I'm pointing at right now, shows this overhead projection. So I can do that. It's as though the paper is directly in front of me, and I can see that this needs to come at an angle. In my mind, it feels very vertical, and so I drew it as essentially a vertical line. But when I use some angle sighting, I recognize that it's actually quite a steep angle. And this is a bit more steep as well. So take your time to really dial in these proportions before we start to get any kind of detail, things like that. And I'm going to take this angle here, kind of give some suggestion of that form. All right, and then let's see, I'm going to find this angle. That's pretty close, but I can bring that out a little bit. I love this kind of vertical edge here. The way the light strikes in right in here, that's going to be a lot of fun to address. So you might also be in this stage thinking about what, it's kind of anticipating what's going to come next in your drawing. So I'm looking at these areas and thinking about how I might tackle them. And it's important to kind of tilt your drawing up. So if you're working at an angle like I am, to be able to see it vertically is really helpful, because everything here looks really wrong. But when I see it vertically and I can compare it to the photos, I feel like it's starting to become a bit more accurate. So it's quite a bit different. So think about these basic shapes. I'm going to erase this down because this is actually more distracting now than anything. Okay, so what I actually want to do is I need to correct that. Need to correct this hill here. Let your marks overrun if you need to. Okay, so now I need to put half dome in here. And one of the things that can happen, this happens a lot in the landscape, is things that are distant. And as our brain kind of really locks in on them in the distance, it takes up a larger portion of our conscious mind. Our thinking goes into that, and it actually makes it feel larger than it actually is. Everything else around it shuts down, and so when I'm looking at half dome back there, and I start to get absorbed in all those details, it just makes it feel bigger than it actually is. So there's a difference between the literal truth and the optical truth, right? So I know that those are giant formations, and my brain is just making them big, even though optically the distance makes them take up a much smaller portion of our field of vision. So I really want to dial this in. And so how do I want to do that? If I'm, let's see, here's where I'm not confident. I'm going to need this section of that cliff to help me out here. So because I want points like this, the tips of these points, the bends, these intersections as orientation points. Then I'm going to take a horizontal guide, and what I'm doing is I'm holding my pencil horizontally and I'm aligning it with the top of half dome there, just that point, and I'm observing where it intersects. So if I visualize a line across here that tip of Half Dome aligns with, I think it's actually got to come down a little bit farther. Then it puts it down right about here. And so when I look at it on the page, it feels really small. But I think that's where it needs to be. So then in the drawing, if we get that right and we get everything else right, we create the context of the landscape, then then a drawing should have that same effect. When the viewer is engaged with those distant mountains, they're gonna feel larger. You're gonna understand the scale of it properly. So this is a bit where drawing can feel like magic in a way. We're creating these illusions that the literal truth of these marks is that they're quite small, but optically, and what it's doing to our mind is we're understanding the scale of it all. All right, so I'm pretty happy with those basic shapes. How does everybody else feel? Anything else? Anything that feels wrong? Am I missing anything major? Like, we're going to be digging into the details, but I want to make sure I get these major forms right. And at this stage, it should start to resemble the scene. And then in this process, we're building everything up slowly, building things up together as a whole, rather than elements in isolation. And then we're in control of how far we want to go with those details. So I mean, you could, and I know a lot of great landscape artists that really don't take the detail much farther. They focus really on dialing in these forms, these shapes, creating a pleasing abstract composition and arrangement of these forms. And so you're certainly welcome to do that. I think for me, the experience that I want to have drawing now is adding some of those details, the subtle details that I really love so much in that middle ground in particular. Okay. Something seems a little bit off here. I want to check. I think this needs to come up a little bit. So something like that. And again, because I'm using the side of the pencil, I'll be able to erase these marks a little bit more easily. Yeah, that pushes that scale up a little bit. I'm looking at some of that negative space in here now to help make some corrections. All right. How is everybody doing? Everybody else following along? I'm going to use the palm of my hand just to kind of knock this down a little bit, soften things. I still have that kind of ghostly image. All right, so again, I think now I'm going to keep focusing on that middle ground. And I say that, as I say that in my head, I realize in order for me to focus on that middle ground, I think I need a little bit more context of that in the foreground. And so I'm going to actually grab my dark, add a little bit more value in here. Just so I have some value contrast. So we're creating an initial value relationship between the foreground, middle ground, and background. So that we're seeing the foreground as being darker, kind of richer in color and value. That middle ground is really catching the light. And I am being intentionally ambiguous about the edge along here. Because then what I can do is I can complete this middle ground and maybe run that a little bit long come in on top with the foreground to create a sharper edge there. So what I'm doing here is mostly just creating a little bit of context, darkening this foreground. Actually, I want to darken this corner a little bit. The light comes in here, so it gets a little bit lighter, and then this gets darker in here. So one of the things I'm noticing is that this the structure on the right is a bit darker in value than over here. The light coming in here, really catching the atmosphere and blasting this. It's coming in on top of this and creating some contrast. Then what that does in terms of the basic value structure is it creates a sequence of values where we have a value relationship where this is light to dark, this gets a little bit lighter, to darker, to lighter, right? You know, we're looking at the value relationships between this is lighter than this is darker than that, this is lighter than that, this is darker than that. You know, those really fundamental things that we're describing. And I'm not making very specific judgments about that. Like, I'm not saying how much darker, how much lighter yet. I'm just creating that fundamental relationship. And then we will look at it more in depth as we go through. And if I squint my eyes, then what happens is that this whole form really becomes a solid shape. So what happens then, what that tells me is that these value relationships are very subtle. So if you're looking at something, you squint and the object disappears, that means the value contrast is really low there. So that happens with both of these formations in the middle ground. When you focus, you might see clearly the details in the scene. But if you squint, they all disappear. It's because it's all very subtle. The way we interpret contrast is really fascinating. All right, I think we reached the ugly duckling stage pretty early, guys. That ugly duckling stage is stage in the drawing process where we're still working things out, and there's a question in my mind about whether or not it's all going to come together. And so part of me right now is panicking because I don't want to make a fool of myself on camera in front of everybody. But I also I've been done enough painting and drawing to know that my only real option is to keep fighting through it and keep trying to just solve problems on the page. So again, keeping these marks fairly general, but we're setting up these basic value structures. Okay. I'm going to smooth things out using the palm of my hand or a paper towel. This works a little bit better. This helps to kind of amplify the idea of the atmosphere in the scene. So it's just a very light pressure that I'm applying. Helps to soften some of those edges as well. All right, so things are slowly coming into focus, and I kind of like the idea that letting some of those edges get lost so that we can really reinforce that concept of atmosphere. The Seurat stage, I like it, Romero. So that is awesome. Yes, the Seurat stage, where if you haven't checked out Seurat's drawing, I love them. His Conte work is just amazing, where he just focuses on fundamental value relationships, eliminates line work. Okay. Yeah, when you become an artist, the ugly duckling stage is usually the foundation to the swan stage. I like it. And, you know, for me, I think that's what it's all about. I think I like the actual problem-solving aspect of it more than the finished work at this point. It's kind of there. We talked about that before. There's drawing, and then there's the drawing, and we each have our own relationship with that relationship. You know, we have our own connection to what that means. You know, do we for us as artists, is it about the object of the drawing, or is it about the process? And like I said, there's going to be some sort of combination of them, but one of the things that makes us unique as artists is that we've each determined for ourselves what, where we put emphasis. And for me, I've recognized that it's really more about the process than anything, than the final product. And it wasn't always that way, but it's become that way over time. Where I like the problem solving aspect to it. All right, so now I still want to be careful about edges and line work here. So I'm trying to refine the edges, but I'm trying to do it in a way where I'm not using a heavy line. So if you need kind of help with that, consider starting in the center of the form, working your way up to the edge, rather than drawing a line and then working in, if that makes sense. Let's see. JCC, I do need to work with Conte. I've talked about it a bunch. I just need to do it. I need to get some Conte and start working on it. You're right. Thank you for calling me out on that. It just, as soon as the show is over, I forget all about it. And I need you guys to keep me in check here. All right, so as I'm working in this form, one of the things I notice is that there's a slight gradation in value where it gets a little bit lighter in here. I also want to be a little bit careful because of the natural, the term is called simultaneous contrast. When we're working with values, when you have a darker value against a lighter value, that edge is going to increase the contrast. So the dark's going to feel darker, the light's going to feel lighter, and it creates this kind of fluting effect. It creates a kind of a shift in value. It makes this side here feel lighter than it actually is. And there's also a bit more atmosphere in that lower section. So I'm kind of working with both of those effects happening. There's literally a change in value in the scene, but then there's there's just the natural effect of simultaneous contrast that I need to be mindful of. All right. Well, thank you for the vote of confidence, Diane. I never make a fool of myself. It's tough, but I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm trying to make a decision what to do here on the top of this cliff where the light is coming in, and in the photo we see a contrast in color where we have a warmer, kind of more orange light striking the side of the cliff against the blue sky, right? And so it's really difficult to determine what the value relationship is there. Is the sky lighter? Is the ground darker? But I think what happens when I squint as a whole is generally darker than that sky. So I'm going to go darker with that light. This is going to be filled in with kind of the white charcoal, but I'm going to block that in. And then add some of the darker shadows. So the highlights on that section are going to be darker in value than the sky. I'm going to make that call, see how it works, and then I can always change it if I don't like it. So, and it's all very subtle. It's not something that hits me first when I look at the scene, but I think it's going to make a big impact on the overall sense of light and atmosphere. And it's one of the reasons I'm working with a colored photo specifically. It's because then it just gives some practice on interpreting those values. So then I can apply that to working from life. So if you ever have a chance to work from life, that is, I think, always going to give you a greater opportunity for growth. And then working from a colored photograph gives you a certain opportunity there. Working from a black and white photo is perfectly fine. It all depends on what you have set for yourself as an objective. So. So I'm still using the side of the pencil, and now I can start to become a little bit more precise with my observations. So This is where it gets really tricky, and you may be experiencing this yourself if you have the larger reference image, for example. When I focus on what's happening in this part of the scene, I see all of these subtle variations in those cracks, those details. And when you focus, it heightens the value contrast a bit more. And so I need to constantly be putting that in check. So what I mean by that is if I get too absorbed in those details, I'm most likely going to draw them to a greater degree of contrast than they actually are. I can let my drawing be just as subtle as those observations to help keep that all in check. One of the things that can be helpful is to look at another part of the drawing or the reference photo, but put your awareness on what you're targeting. And so if I look here, if I look at this section on the reference photo, I'm thinking about what's happening over there and trying to pay attention to what stands out. I'm also squinting my eyes, blurring my vision, trying to look at the scene in as many ways as possible to really tell me the whole story of the scene. Like I said, the more you focus, the more things actually get distorted. And sometimes we develop this mentality that to just work harder, and we apply that to looking as well. But I'd say in this case, often looking harder, it can do harm if it's not applied at the right stage, right? We often want to get to that point of really intense looking and focus too early. You want to bring that in at the very end once you've really blocked everything in. All right, I appreciate the comments. All right, I think I want to move over to this stage. This is starting to bother me a little bit that it's so out of focus. So I'm going to, again, starting from the center of the form, working out, kind of looking back and forth between the reference photo and the drawing. To really determine, and see the specific forms. If you need to kind of orient yourself by drawing a mark along that edge, just try to keep it light, try to keep it on the side of the pencil, again, so that it doesn't emboss the page. Because if I haven't placed it properly, I want to be able to move it around, and an embossed page makes it difficult to do so. But already I'm starting to really enjoy the sense of atmosphere that's forming in the drawing. So I want to keep that going. And as I block in some of these values here, I'm using kind of a soft circular mark, something that's fairly omnidirectional, so that I think it'll help to reinforce that sense of atmosphere. Letting the pencil roll my fingers so that I'm not developing flat spots as I go. And I'm not worried about the trees along that edge. I'm still focusing on the major form, but trying to make that major form more specific. Okay. One of the things that happens as you draw more is that you're going to get increasingly speedy at making decisions and observations. So depending on where you are in your path as a drawing artist, we all work at different paces, and however you work is all good. So I'm faster at drawing than some people. I'm slower than others. But kind of try to lock in on what your kind of natural pace is. But one of the things that will most likely happen is you'll be able to make observations more quickly and more strategically. And so what I notice, and I'm trying to kind of slow things down for if you're new, and trying to slow things down a little bit for myself so that I can kind of talk through some of the decisions. And this is where I'd love to hear everybody else kind of share your thoughts on this as well. But when I'm making an observation, I'm calculating a lot at one time. So before I look at the reference photo, I have in my mind where I want to go. So if I'm working on this section of the landscape, I go right to it when I look at it. And I'm trying to figure out what am I targeting, what within that, am I looking at that major angle? Am I looking at the specific shape along an edge? Am I looking for the value? Am I looking for the texture? There's a particular element, and I try to isolate that one thing so it's not trying to solve all the problem of this formation here, trying to solve that all at once, right? It's just one step at a time. And when I go look at the reference photo, then it's looking at that specific form as well as doing a quick check-in with everything else around it. Where is it relative to other forms? How light or how dark? Is there a particular textural quality to it? How does that compare to the things around it? So that all happens very quickly, and it can sometimes be frustrating for people who are just new to drawing, because it can all feel very slow. But I think if you take your time and break it down, make one decision at a time, you're going to find that processing goes much faster. You're going to develop a much faster processing speed, and it's just going to happen as in second nature. You're going to be kind of reacting to all of those things rather than really having to make a conscious decision and then move on. So I just wanted to kind of put that into context a little bit. Because like I said, it can sometimes feel overwhelming to have an idea in your head of trying to balance everything. Try to get the proportions right, try to get the values right, get the textures. Consider your mark making, the composition, all of those things. It's a lot, but try to isolate one decision at a time, and try not to dwell on that decision. Make it. Look, if I'm looking at say this side along here, I'm going to make some quick judgments and then move on to something else. Come back around to it later and add a little bit more to it. So you're adding little bits of information to elements in the drawing throughout the entire process, and the whole thing is going to be coming together. But really, drawing, the power in drawing to me is that it's a way. It's all about making decisions, right? It's a way to better understand the subject through making very specific decisions, and we all have, our unique combination of those decisions. All right, what do I want to do now? Let's see. I feel like there's still something a little bit off here on this major form. But what is it? I think, all right, here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to kind of shift gears, work on the background. So I'm at this point where I don't really know the answer to a problem. And what I've learned over years of drawing is that rather than try to just sit and focus on this one problem over and over and over again and try to get it, I just got to move on to something else because often the answer to that just needs time. I need time to really kind of think through it, or I need something else in the drawing to develop. And then sometimes I'll kind of delay making a decision and kind of solving the problem in a certain area of the drawing, and it just never comes together. So that's one of the things about drawing. So I'm doing just some negative drawing. So thinking about now, I'm refining this shape by thinking about the negative space around it, the shape of the sky that is created by this form kind of impeding on it. All right, so I'm going to soften it, build up a little bit of tone. So here's what we're going to do, is I'm going to actually discover the profile of this this hillscape here by doing some negative drawing here, building up some of that tone, and then erasing the shape of the sky. Because when I add the white charcoal, I don't want there to be graphite on that section that I add. So this is all about being very kind of sensitive, delicate. It's all about these subtle value relationships here. And already, I can feel my brain calibrating. I'm looking at the image in the screen and thinking that this is white, but it's not. I got to remind myself that I'm coming in with a white charcoal. Don't like that shape there. So now I need to find that line here, that profile of that formation. I'm going to do some negative drawing, erasing out that sky. So using the eraser, and I'm doing this on purpose because it helps to me to be more gentle with some of these formations. So I'm not using a line for these. I'm going to bring in the kneaded eraser, kind of clean off the entire sky area. Oh, okay, look at that. And that smudge that was really embedded, it just pops right off. I love this paper. It's such good stuff. Okay. All right, so let's get that in, that we're going to get this distant area done. So I'm going to switch to the white charcoal now. I've gotten rid of the graphite. And here we go. So this requires some kind of negative drawing, trying to draw the shape of that sky. Around the around Half Dome there, using the side of the pencil, and that helps me to keep a sharp point for when I need it. And it's requiring a little bit of focus, so I apologize for the silence. So kind of working back and forth up to that edge to try to discover, again, the profile of that hill there. This is something that I am glad that I did a preparatory version of this to help kind of think through this. And so just kind of keep that in mind for yourself. You may find that this is just a preparatory drawing. Maybe that this is just a kind of a preliminary sketch for you. And then you may apply some of the learning from this process onto really a more final version if you want. So let's see. Mariana Wood, at least shine from graphite. I'm curious about your question there, Mariana. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, the graphite does create a shine that we want to worry about. And mostly what it can do is, with this white charcoal being used to create the lighter values, with a layer of graphite, it can sometimes remove the tooth of the paper and then the charcoal doesn't quite hold up. It also will mix with the white charcoal to create kind of a bluish gray, and I don't really want that in the sky. I kind of like the feeling of warmth in this landscape as a whole. So, but I don't know if I'm addressing your question, so if not, let me know. All right. Let's see. I just want to get to, I see some questions here coming through. Adrian is saying you took an oil painting class. Curriculum was designed so that you finished 3 paintings during each session. I did 5 sessions and ended up with 4 completed paintings instead of 15. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to kind of share. Again, yeah, everybody kind of works at their own pace. And we talk about that here. My hope is that I'm going to be doing, thousands of drawings in my lifetime. And this is just one step along the way. And the same applies to painting. And then, Alan, would these steps apply to portraits as well? I think generally, yes. But again, this is kind of, I guess, my process for it. And it's not necessarily the same that all kind of portrait artists use, or any artist. We all kind of have our own way through it. But I think in general, it's not all that far off from what is pretty common and for most drawing artists and painters. That kind of starting with a gesture to help orient yourself, adjusting the proportions, and then building through to the details there. So, focusing on values, focusing on line work, texture, things like that. And, we all as artists have our own kind of unique combination of that, where we prioritize some things over others. For some of you, you may feel like, getting the right proportions is not quite as important. It's, you really want to capture the spirit of it through expressive marks or intentionally distorted proportions, things like that. For some of you, you may feel like it's everything to have the correct proportions. For me, portrait work is a little bit more reliant on proportion than landscape. You can be a little bit more. Landscape can be a little bit more forgiving sometimes, but I would say generally it's a similar process. But also, like I said, if we're treating drawing as really a problem-solving tool, as an expression of the evolution of our understanding of the subject, then you can find your own way through it too. So you may find that the process that I'm going through here just doesn't work for you. It doesn't align with the way you observe the world around you, and it's not serving you. So then you'll come up with your own way through it. So some of you may find it more effective to kind of work out the proportions, create a map essentially for things first before going to a gesture. But this is just what I've kind of resolved. All right, so I need to look at how is this hooking up. It's a little bit more blown out. I'm gonna adjust the filters just a touch here because it's not quite there. That's probably better. That's a little bit more accurate to what I'm seeing in real life now that things are starting to come together. The camera is understanding the form just a little bit better. So I'm going to adjust the exposure settings a little bit here. Okay. Let's see. I just want to check some questions here. How it feels to know you will come up with a nice drawing when you start. Yeah, that's interesting. So if that is an important part of the experience. I think having something you feel confident in. I don't know as if I ever started drawing really knowing that it's going to work. I think there is that question, which I kind of like. Again, it's the struggle. It's kind of like what makes fishing fun, right? Is you don't really know if you're going to catch something, right? And so there is that sense of mystery in the whole process. Like, will it work out? And the more you work, the more confident you'll become in all of that. But all right, so I think now. I see a question here. Any brand that would give least shine? Mariana's asking a question. You know, I don't know that answer, but it's an interesting question. So if anybody has an answer to that question, with regards to graphite, generally it's a metal essentially. So it's going to have some of that shine. So it might be that, you know, try working on a kind of a rougher paper that might actually help. You know, I like these cotton rag papers. This is going to have some shine, but less than if I were to use like a Bristol board or a vellum or something that's really smooth. So that might be something to look into, or really kind of a different medium altogether. Something like charcoal could work for you then if shine is something that you're concerned with. It's more difficult to, Adrian is saying it's more difficult to lie to your friends about drawing than fishing. Yeah, yeah, that's true. And then you have other good comment. I wish I could say that extra time resulted in great paintings, but I would have been better off just accepting the mistakes and moving forward. I would have had more practice that way. I love that you shared that. Thank you so much for doing that. How we conceive of what is productive time when learning to draw, and again, it's going to be different for everybody, but it is something to consider. I've generally recommended for people, if you're short on time, if you don't have a lot of time in your life and you want to get better at drawing, I think it's, from my experience, it's been more effective to do more gesture drawing and sketching than spend that time doing finished drawing. Because, you know, that detail work can ultimately be very satisfying, but with drawing being about making a lot of decisions, adding detail doesn't often really give you an opportunity to address many of those decisions. A lot of those decisions about scale, proportions, you know, angles, movement, things like that can be handled in a quick gesture. So you're addressing a lot very quickly. But then when it comes down to final detail, it can often be more about execution. You're not adjusting things. It's really the work of executing on it. And so depending on where you are in your own artistic practice, you know, if that's something that really connects with you, if you really like that time in the details, then that's great. If your time is limited and you're trying to boost your skills in some of those other areas, then those quick gestures, I think, are a great way to go. You're building up hand-eye coordination. You're looking at composition. You're doing all sorts of things that can be done very, very quickly. And in that way, with a gesture, you can do, you know, 20 one-minute gestures, or you can do one 20-minute drawing. And they're each going to have their advantages and disadvantages, but just something to put out there. Samina is saying, using hard lead graphite pencils where there's more clay mixture and using many tedious layers instead of mushing down graphite in one layer significantly reduces the shine that comes with graphite. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. You know, like I don't necessarily think a whole lot about that, so it's really good to hear you say that. It looks like you've spent a lot of time really working with graphite. I typically kind of work with, I like to work with softer graphite and then modulate values through pressure control. But I think it achieves, you know, then what you're referring to, that you have the issues with shine. I've just always kind of accepted it or not really been bothered by shine, because to me that's what graphite drawing just does. But so it's really cool to hear you say that. And I think those are some really important tips. So I'm just going to erase this down here. So now this large formation here is the natural tone of the paper. So early on we kind of drew some marks in there, and now we're erasing it out. I may add some tone in there a little bit, but let's see. And then Anne is saying, generally, I would say not press down, just build up graphite gradually to avoid the shine. Do many strokes in an area you want to darken rather than pressing harder. Awesome. Very good suggestions. Thank you. This is why we're drawing together. Because there's a lot to drawing that I don't know, but it's helpful for me to know, and it's best to learn from people like you guys that can share it. So so just kind of cleaning up further. What I kind of switched to this eraser here because I was observing the white charcoal turning blue along here, so where it's mixing with the graphite, and I'm not sure I really like that. So I'm going to come back in here. There are these layers of kind of a light fog in here that I want to address. You know, our sensitivity to value relationships is really high. You know, we see these subtle variations so easily. And so I just kind of remind myself that then I want the drawing, the viewer, to really have that same impact with the drawing. There can sometimes be this kind of this sense that we see a subtle variation, subtle shift in value, and then we need to make that explicit. We need the viewer to really understand that we've seen it, so we overstate it. And I say we, I say me. It's really, at least that's what I do. So, but it is something I've seen some other artists do as well and struggle with. So, I'm just kind of often a lot of my drawing process is then kind of knocking down value relationships. So just overstating in them and then it's kind of simplifying them, making them more subtle. But then there's also then the issue of making things too subtle, which I've certainly had. I've definitely fallen victim to that. You know, working on a drawing or a painting, and I fall in love with all these subtle value and color shifts, and I think I really nailed it, and then I put it on the wall in an exhibit or something, and it just falls away. You can't even see it. And so stepping back from a distance and looking at it from a distance can be helpful in that, to really, you know, put into context how it's going to hold up. So just kind of doing some negative drawing here, by adding some of that atmosphere, but I think that's a little bit too strong. So if there's too much, this white charcoal really lifts easily. And also, let me see how it smudges. So when your kneaded eraser builds up some material, it can sometimes be actually an effective smudging tool. And then if you need to lift more, you just kind of press down. In this case, I'm going to amplify that atmospheric effect by smudging a little bit more. All right, and now I'm going to come back in, grab the graphite here, and this is a very light touch. Just adding a little bit of sharpness to some of these forms here. But I'm not going to do that throughout this entire profile here. And, you know, in this case, I'm just kind of sharpening up Half Dome so that it becomes a stronger focal point. You know, kind of soften it, let it diffuse a little bit down there. And then as I come in here, I can add a little bit more definition to that hillside there. And again, this is where you're in control of how much detail you want. You know, I think I could essentially just not touch this and we would understand the scene pretty well. But I'm going to add a little bit of detail here, and that can sometimes just come down to you making a decision about what experience you want to have in your drawing. You know, and we talk about that here as well. You know, the drawing process is a reflection of our inner state, our mental state, and it's a reflection of it, and it affects it. So, you know, if I'm having a kind of a scattered day and I want to bring myself into focus a little bit more, I may intentionally do a drawing that requires more of that. Or if I'm scattered and I don't really care, just need to move things around, then I'll make a drawing that's equally scattered and kind of energetic. So just kind of tapping with a kneaded eraser, lifting off some of that line. And then it's interesting how, like right in here, there's this kind of a dark area in that gap between the layers of fog. And my suspicion is that it's casting you're seeing the dark hillside that's in shadow, and it's also casting a little shadow itself. And so as you notice, I'm going right over this edge. I know this edge is darker than that, so if I'm creating a light layer here, it's not going to really inhibit me when I come back later and darken this up. But if I try to get close to that edge, I run the risk of creating a halo that could end up actually disturbing things. All right, so on that note, let's see. I kind of like the way this is kind of creating this vignette, this light vignette around the edge. So I'm going to sharpen up this edge along in here. To me, that becomes a focal point. Now, in a reference photo like this, everything is in focus. So they use an exposure that creates these sharp edges. And of course, there's the atmosphere, but everything is in fairly crisp detail. Our drawing doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You may want it to be that way for yourself, or you may decide to be more selective on what areas you bring into focus. So I think I'm gonna be intentionally selective about that. So for like these edges here where you see the trees, one of the things that can be helpful is to create a contrast between the sections of the hills where the trees are overlapping. It kind of softens that edge visually, and then the sharp edges of the rock, right? And so when we come up here, we see this section of the landscape where you have those trees, and I'm just using this overhand grip and these kind of light vertical kind of vibrations there. And then as I come over here, this section has that cliff, and so I want kind of sharper marks here. And that graphite kind of cuts into the charcoal, and it kind of carves it away a little bit in an interesting way. So it's one of the things I'm thinking about here, because the way we deal with those edges can be subtle expressions of the landscape that the viewer picks up on. And so I'm trying to do what was mentioned here is the light layers of graphite. I'm not pressing down very much at all. So as I said at the top of the show here, things are it's gonna get to a point where you're gonna be seeing very subtle shifts. It's gonna look like I'm not doing anything, but gradually it'll come together. Greg is asking a question. Said, I've never used white charcoal with graphite, so you can do a layer of graphite over the white charcoal, but not white charcoal over graphite. I mean, I guess technically you can kind of do what works. If you've built up a layer of graphite, again, it just starts to take down the tooth of the paper, so the white charcoal may not hold. It's also, they're just going to mix together, and that's going to happen whether you put the charcoal first or the graphite first. They're going to mix together to create a particular tone. And if that tone is something that you like, then you might intentionally layer them. If it's not, then I generally would recommend kind of erasing down the page and separating the two a little bit. And that's kind of what I've done here. So. All right, so as I come down in here, I love this little notch, that form shadow there. All right, so now I want to start to become a little bit more specific with this edge here, because then the negative space will suggest the tree line there. And so as I get to that edge, you can see I'm in this overhand grip, and it's this kind of modified grip. I don't really know what's happening, but this finger is putting pressure backwards against then my index finger and my palm. And so that gives me some control, and all the movement is really happening from the arm rather than the wrist. And in that way, I can control the pressure pretty well. I can stabilize with this finger here. I'm kind of holding it above the page, but I'm using the side of the pencil to kind of create that. And trying to create some variety along that edge. But I also got to get that line right. I can, from this angle here, it looks correct, but I look above and I realize that it's a steeper angle than is in the reference, and it's going to kind of work against me. It's going to make the landscape feel too tilted. And I'm also letting this roll in my fingers as I go, again, to avoid flat spots. All right, so now I'm going to address some of the subtlety on this side. So this tone here becomes the light, and then as I add in some of those details, what I'm looking for are the shapes of the shadows. So again, using the side of the pencil here, rather than creating a line and filling it in, I'm trying to use using the side of the pencil in this kind of vertical or circular motion, and really observe the edges and that transition from light to shadow. And so this is where I start to pay attention to the structure of the landscape and what is happening here. What am I looking at? Trees along that edge? Is it a rock edge? And then rather than try to really match every mark specifically, I'm taking it in as a whole, and ask, are they kind of rounded marks? Are they sharp marks? Are they a bit more diffused? But it's that shape of the shadow that's really going to help to define the objects there. There's an edge right in here that's a bit soft. So this is all about subtlety. And if it's, oh no, I just broke my pencil. That's frustrating. But luckily, that's why I have my B, right? So I can just keep working. They're very similar, but that's quite a bit darker, isn't it? I wasn't pressing down all that hard, but definitely must have been hard enough, huh? And so, again, I'm trying to create simple shapes and let the materials do a bit of the work for me rather than switching to a tripod grip and drawing this way with those details, using the side of the pencil and creating some suggestions of marks. Then in here we have what looks like it should be a waterfall that looks like it's got a little snowfield in there maybe. The water's not flowing. This is definitely one part of the country I would love to go see. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm hoping one day I'll be able to get to Yosemite. And so just trying to change up the marks, make a few marks, come back to the reference photo, make a few marks. And then really just kind of observe what's happening on the page. How does it read? Is it too subtle, too bold? Those types of things. I think I'm going to try to just be selective on where I add those details. But there's just something about all that subtlety in that shadow that I really respond to. So it's requiring a little bit more focus, so I apologize. And now I kind of want, like this edge just feels too obscured, too unfocused. So I'm switching to this tripod grip, and I'm dropping in a line and kind of feathering it back out a little bit. And I really want that edge to be sharp. I don't know why. I think that's just where my sensibility lies, and that, again, that may be different for you, which is what makes this cool. What I love about drawing, especially when I was teaching, is we might all be working from the same still life or something, same subject, and you look on the wall and everyone looks unique. It's wild to me. We're all making very similar decisions. Again, working from the same subject, yet they're all going to look different, and I love it. All right, so I'm feeling pretty good about that whole area. Kind of like in my preparatory drawing, I spent more time on this, but I kind of like where it is at this point. And I feel like my eye goes more down in here. So this is where I want to add. I love that little bit of light right in here that catches. So I'm going to erase out that section and then drop in that light. And there's actually I think there's a few little rocks and things in here that catch the light. And this might help to bring things forward. So it's I'm being really deliberate with these actions here, and because I don't want to really smudge things. If anything, then these marks I'm putting are hopefully just going to lay on top of the graphite and not mix to create that blue. I don't want to fuss. I just want to place it and go. How's that read? Kind of like that. I don't know as if I want to do much more. But actually what I want to do is some of this back in here, sharpen using that negative space a little bit more. Okay. Whew, all right. Alan is saying, you said you don't know if you're going to make it. Does that happen to you even in the level you are in? Oh, absolutely. It happens a lot when I'm painting too. I feel like I generally have a little bit more confidence in drawing but not much more. And I've been drawing for a long time. And I used to be really hard on myself about that, about doing a good job. And that's where my identity was really tied up in the idea that that art was what I was good at, right? And so, what happens if I do a bad drawings or paintings? Does that mean I'm no good, right? So, definitely struggled with things like that, but it's yeah, like I said, now I try to embrace that as part of the process. It's like, if you enjoy doing puzzles or things like that, part of the joy in it is that struggle. There's that part you're like, I don't know if this is actually going to work. And so, and that again, that's where I think I've learned to emphasize drawing, the act of drawing, over the drawing. All right, so as I'm, and kind of getting back to that thought, I don't know, I mean, that's where I'm at right now, and it would, like I said, it would benefit me, I think, to have some drawings where it's really about just technically executing, giving myself a challenge, but not giving myself a way out. Saying that I have to really nail it. Okay. Now I really love, like I said, I love the way the light comes in here and it strikes the edge of that cliff, that corner, and then it kind of comes back. It creates this wall that curves back there. So how do I want to do that? I want to be careful. It's kind of sharper along in here. All right, so as I come down in here, this is all really kind of tricky. And I need to determine how much detail I want to have. So what I'm looking at are the alternating patterns of light and dark in this area, and it's hard to lock in on it. So there's this overall value in here, but then we go from, this is darker than that, this is darker than that, but this part is darker than that part. So kind of thinking through it in my head, because this part is in light, but it's not as light as the light that's striking the edge of that cliff there. So that's where I need to kind of dial that in a little bit. And I think what I need to have is I need to kind of work all of that at once. And then adding to that is the element of the edges. So if I look down here, for example, it gets really sharp at the base, and then as it comes up here, it wraps around kind of a more curved part of that rock where it becomes more diffused. And that gets really critical, because the way you handle the edges is what unifies the two. It allows us to recognize that the light and the shadow areas, while being two different values, are part of the same object. And it's so easy for those to be separate. And so we observe the specific shape of that light, for example, and we observe the specific shape of the shadow. But if we're not sensitive at the edges, we run the risk of them feeling like two different shapes, two different objects, rather than one object that happens to be in light and shadow, if that makes sense. All right, so as I come down here, I'm again just looking at that transition area more than anything. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. So as I come down here, now I'm shifting to thinking about the trees to create that bottom edge. And it's this, again, this kind of modified grip where I'm creating these short kind of vertical vibrations and then kind of covering over with a horizontal kind of wipe. And I recognize I do that. That's something I do a lot when I paint. And I think that's carried over in the drawing, and the idea of laying down some brushwork and then knocking it off with a palette knife and kind of knocking off some of those edges. And it just occurred to me, I'm like, oh, that's a kind of a habit. There's a rhythm we get into as artists, and we'll end up making marks that are kind of unique to our own kind of rhythm. Okay. So now I think what I want to do is come in here and strike that light, again, where it's a little bit harder down in here. And I'm going to focus on where the edges are harder and then let it feather out. Again, this is where I have to remind myself that I can go lighter if I need to, but I'm going to see how much I can achieve just using the tone of the paper. And then hopefully that contrast in tone between the paper and then the white will be effective. It's just too dark in here. Blending stump time. Okay. Bringing out the blending stump. I can do that over here too, just kind of smoothing things out a little bit. Still using that overhand grip, so I'm using the side of the blending stump. And if anything, I want to try to contribute to the form. So thinking about kind of subtle variations of light and dark within that area. And then just leaning in on it a little bit more where I need it to be darker, letting up where I need it to be lighter. Okay. Let's see. Adrian has a really good question. Would having basic photography knowledge make me better at drawing? That is a really good question. I guess I'm really kind of curious to hear what everybody else says too. My take on it is, let's see, how do I feel about that? I think generally, like, expanding your skill set with everything is good. That's the way I feel about myself, is like I encounter new things and generally find a way that it connects to my artwork in some way. And so I think taking some time to learn new skills will generally have a benefit to your artwork. Specifically with photography, I think it can be helpful to help see composition, and it could be to help see value relationships, all of those things that I think can be helpful. But I say that as a person who I've really struggled with photography. It's like I know some really good photographers, and it blows my mind how easy it is to take a photograph and how hard it is to take a good one. We can all kind of snap pictures now, but man, I see things differently. When I'm selecting a scene for a painting, I just perceive it a little bit differently, and the same with photography, with drawing, and often it doesn't. What I think is going to make for an exciting painting or drawing doesn't really work in the photograph, and so I think that definitely is an area where I'm working on improving myself. But I think you can be a fine draftsperson, artist, or drawing artist, and also struggle with photography. Okay, so what I'm doing along in here is I'm looking along that edge where we roll from the light into the shadow. And the shapes that we make along here can go a long way in describing the specific landscape that you're in. When I'm working on a landscape painting, or a drawing, to me, it's about capturing that space specifically. It's not just using it as a template to kind of repeat a set of actions that I use with every drawing or painting. I wanted to say something about that specific place, and so the type of rock that you have here creates specific shapes of light and shadow. So that's what makes the geology here different than say some place on the Maine coast, right? Or in Florida, the geology functions differently, and so to me that becomes kind of an important element to focus on. So what I'm looking at are the types of shapes that get formed at that transition between light and shadow here, because that's what's going to tell me that's going to tell me what what is unique about that space. And so I may make different marks here than I would make in a different landscape with rock from a different part of the world. Like I said, it all comes down to observing that transition line between light and shadow. And then we see, as we fall into this shadow here, there are these subtle variations, these kind of striations. And I'm not going to get each and every one exactly right. I'm going to, I want to try to get a sense of the type of marks, the types of shapes that we're seeing in this landscape. So, and I kind of like the light that's happening up in here, so I'm going to be really, really kind of delicate in here because I don't want to disrupt that too much. I just want to add a little bit of detail. So I'm going to use the blending stump that's now well used to create these soft trees, and that's hopefully going to lock into the atmosphere a little bit more than if I were to use the graphite pencil. Okay, and then I'm going to come back in with the eraser and pull out some of the lights in there, but I'm going to stick on the shadow side of things for now. All right. Oh, Anne is saying if you are near the finish, you can also apply workable fixative very lightly before using white. That's a great way to kind of create that barrier. That's a good concept there. So. Samin is saying, for me, enjoying the process instead of reaching the goal has made anything tiring or imperfect not matter to me. It makes me focus on what I'm doing. Awesome. Yeah, kind of absorb the process over the product. Let's see. Hello. I see comments from Agent Ninja and Leo. Oh, Sylvia, you're pretty close to Yosemite. If I make it out there, that'd be fun. You could be my guide. Alan is asking a question. Is there a purpose to make some areas smudged and smooth and others more rough? Does that help with contrast? Yes, that is exactly what we're thinking about, is controlling the contrast. Now, again, this is where our own unique sensibilities come into play, because you may not really connect with that for yourself. Maybe if you like the idea of everything being soft and atmospheric, or maybe everything in sharp contrast. What I'm making that intentional choice here, though, to vary that, bring certain areas into sharp focus and let other areas be soft, because I want the subject of this to really be the atmosphere as much as it is the place itself, if that makes sense. And so having that effect where some things are in focus, like this, I can let be soft, bring in sharp focus here, and that also helps to direct the viewer's eyes a little bit more. It says something about what's important to me as the artist, and it gives the viewer kind of a guide through the landscape. What should they look at first, essentially, and then second and third, really what is it about. Now, I say that having been an artist that I worked with sharp edges for a long time. I really like the work of Neil Welliver, who has a particular style where everything is kind of created to the same level of detail, and there's a control and a precision to his brushwork that I really like. And so I would work that same way as well for a long time. But now I'm exploring that concept of atmosphere a bit more, where I'm being more selective about what is in focus and what's not. And it just could be, where I'm at in my own life. I may end up going back to this idea of having everything in sharp focus. But it's a matter of what works for you, what doesn't. And also, like, one of the things I think about too often is I try to analyze what is my path through the landscape? What do I really react to? We take in a lot of information that our subconscious mind weeds out, and our conscious mind kind of extracts just the highlights from. So the highlights for you might be a little bit different than the highlights for me, but we're all filtering information because we can't consciously process everything in a split second, right? It's just too much. And so what I try to pay attention to is I figure out what am I really connecting with, and then what do and then let the drawing or the painting kind of reflect that. So being it's what I'm editing out that indicates what is unique about the form, the landscape there. So so I might sharpen an area because if I'm in a landscape, a big landscape like this, for example, I might find that I get fixated in one spot. Maybe I'll stare at this ledge for a long time. It just captures my attention, and I may not even notice another area in the landscape, right? And it's kind of like opening up the refrigerator and not seeing, like what you're looking for right there on the shelf, right? Sometimes our brain just kind of leaves things out. And so I try to pay attention to, what is being left out by my mind, and what am I fixating on? And then let the image kind of get built around that. Okay, so as I come up here, and on that note, this is a great opportunity for everybody to share your own thoughts on that. This is what's really awesome, is because we all have our own kind of connections with that, with detail, sharpness, etc. All right, so I'm just kind of erasing out shapes of light. Now again, thinking about now the inverse of those shadow shapes we were talking about along those edges. And it's a little bit more diffused than I'd like, so I'm going to come back in and add a little bit more detail. There's just something about that ledge that's really capturing my attention. Okay. But I think overall it's creating that sense of atmosphere that I like. Now, I'm going to come back in here because again, one of the things that I really resonate with is this wall that we're looking across. The light's catching that rim, but we understand that it wraps back around. We're shearing across it. And one of the indications that we're shearing across a wall that's curving back in space are these thin lines. Everything that gets compressed together along that wall. So I want to suggest some of these. Okay. And now come back in with the white highlight. Actually, no. Why did it do that? Okay, whew. We're back on. It says we have plenty of battery there, so but it's not in focus. You can see an extreme close-up there of the scene. Let's see if I can adjust to this. Okay, everything is really grainy right now for some reason. So I'm going to keep going. I hope that we can pull that into focus a little bit more. It's in sharp focus right now, but the source seems to be really messing with things. All right, let's see if that's better. I think that's better. Okay. Hopefully it's not going to shut off on me. This happens periodically, so I'm just going to go as quickly as I can. This is live, so that's what makes it fun. When this has happened before, things just kind of shut off, and I apologize for those technical issues. I just want to focus on this ledge. This is a highlight, as it were, for me. It's something that really kind of stands out. So I've erased down to the bare paper, and I'm just being selective where I'm adding some of this white. I don't want to fill in the whole area. I'm just looking for areas where the highlight might be a little bit stronger than others, to bring a little bit more kind of structure, I guess, to that. Now, so I'm adding that kind of the tonal highlight, tonal highs, just in a few select areas. And that way it brings some focus down in there. I think we can bring a little light in here. But it's less is more in this case. So I don't want to overdo it. If I add too much white, then it creates a flat white shape. Instead, what I'm looking at are highlights that are really at the peak of the that particular form. But what's really carrying the form is that gray tone of the paper that I've erased back down to. All right, and then I come back in here, and there are some trees along this edge that I think are really essential for kind of sharpening it back up. So I'm kind of thinking about these trees kind of as like a constellation, or connect the dots, right? Rather than drawing a line, just little dots that span across that edge. So I don't want to labor on it too much, but just enough to kind of define that edge a little bit more. And if we need to, let me see if I can punch in. I can't really, it ends up cropping out a frame, but that kind of shows a little bit what's happening along that edge. Okay. So now, what I want to do, this is a bit too dark in here. So I can just tap with a kneaded eraser, bring something up here. But I do want to sharpen in just this one select area. Give it a little bit more form. All right, thank you, everybody. Diane, it's good comment there about the smooth and the rough areas. Yeah, Mad Moments go, yes, I should add a dragon. That would be pretty awesome. All right, thank you so much. All right, AP Creations, love the comment. All right. So yeah, things are looking pretty misty here. So I may end up, as Diane is saying, I may come back in a little bit later to sharpen up in some areas. What I think is bothering me right now is I haven't really resolved this point of land here. So I'm bringing a little bit more, it's like a sharper, it's a sharper edge than I think I've created. And to me, I think that's important, the way it really reinforces the concept of these rock formations as such sharp features protruding from the earth. All right, I think that works out a little bit better. And then I kind of erased off an area here that's a bit too large, so I'm going to sharpen it a little bit by cutting into that form a little bit more. All right, that feels a little bit better. Kind of just give a suggestion of some of those cracks in there. And if you're doing that, if you're adding some of these kind of subtle lines, really look at kind of the rhythm of the marks. I've mentioned this before. My natural inclination is to create these kind of evenly spaced stripes, to get in this rhythm, which is like chunk, kind of moving across. And so I kind of have to force myself to create this irregularity to the marks, and try to see that in the reference photo as well, so that it doesn't read as stripes coming down the side, but instead as kind of cracks. And so then what that's doing now is I'm sharpening up here where it comes out of that mist. So just kind of tighter marks at the top there. All right. And now I think what's going to really pull everything together is if I shift to that foreground. I think it's about that time. We're almost 2 hours in. Holy smokes, that's gone fast. So I'm going to try to move quickly to try to get that done. Looking forward to tomorrow. I had this talk with Ron Hicks. Super excited. So it's part of our open studios at Artist Network. So it's unfortunately it's exclusive to members. You can ask questions, but it's all the whole talk is going to be about kind of finding your authentic voice as an artist. If you haven't checked out his work, it's amazing. Go to ronhicks.com. Amazing. I guess he kind of started more as a figurative, kind of more portrait artist, and I love, of course, his figurative work, but there's an abstract quality to him as well that just hits me in the gut. It's good stuff. So check out his work. All right. I think this is kind of bothering me here, this stripe in here. So I'm gonna soften that up a little bit. Kind of let that hillside just kind of fade off into the distance a little bit more. Bring that forward. That's one of the things that happens in the landscape as well, is things at varying distances start to fade away. So as I focus on this section in the reference photo, for example, my mind just kind of ignores everything else behind it. And then when I focus on that, it kind of ignores this thing. Even though they're really close to one another, it's easy for it just to fade away in our consciousness as we start to observe them. And so I like to think about that as well, and pay attention to what kind of disappears, and how we can control the focus a little bit by emphasizing certain things. So, all right. So what I'm going to do, no! I'm going to break the pencil again. What do I have? Do I have one ready to go? What do I have here? I've got a 3B. I'm going to use the 3B now because I just broke the other one. And I can go darker here anyways. So I am applying a bit more pressure. It's going to make it shiny. And I'm kind of intentionally going at this horizontal mark to contrast that diagonal thrust of the landscape there. So I've roughed in that line, but I don't want lines that kind of parallel the angle of the that hillside, because then it's going to flatten things out. I want to create a sense that we're wrapping around or rolling across. There's a plane that angles in across up to that edge, and that's what I want to emphasize a bit more. And so I'm not going to nitpick on the form too much here. I really want to kind of capture that the overall experience there. And I know we're running low on time, short on time here. So I'm just going to try to be more gestural with it. Sorry, I'm cutting into the shot. You can see the tooth of the paper, and that's going to actually help me suggest some of that, the ground covering there. And so what's kind of significant here is the light and shadow, and also that contrast between those two types of vegetation, the spruce trees, those evergreens that really have those sharp points to them, and then that lower kind of bushy ground cover that is much more rounded, and that the grain of the paper kind of naturally helps to suggest that. So I'm really focusing on blocking in those values first, and then we'll try to suggest those trees. But if this is my focal point, I'm going to intentionally leave this kind of unfinished. But I want to kind of talk through some strategies that you might use if you want to add more detail over in those areas. So this is where I have to kind of contort myself. I would normally rotate the paper in some of these areas here. I really like these Derwent pencils. They're really nice and smooth. Some graphite can get really scratchy, even the softer versions, the softer graphite in the line. All right, so what I'm observing is there's this kind of clump of trees right around in here that's in shadow. So I'm going to work on blocking that again using the side of the pencil. Now, with these trees, what can be helpful is to become aware of both the positive and the negative space. So the way they overlap, each tree that you draw becomes a positive space overlapping the thing behind it, becomes a negative space as the tree in front of it overlaps it, right? And so I don't spend too much time really focusing on it, but if I hold that in my head, it can sometimes help me achieve the correct shape. So as I'm working up here, for example, I'm thinking about the trees that project in on top of the shape around it. And as I draw it down, I'm letting my marks kind of lift off the page and trying to think about that shape here of that light of the tree in front of it, if that makes sense. And so when I'm drawing these trees here, in general, it's this vertical mark and then a slight kind of horizontal vibration as you drag down to suggest the trees there. And then there are the shapes of the trees that kind of stand out as you try to target areas of light and dark. Kind of look for the darker shapes. I think that's where you're going to get the most mileage out of your marks, is by drawing in the shadows and letting the lighter areas bleed together. So now, I'm going to move quickly through this. So a lot of these are going to be off by a little bit. So I'm thinking generally. I know there's a darker mass here, and then there is kind of a scattering of shadows throughout the rest of this area here. So if you have time and you really want to dial in all of the detail, go ahead and do that. If you don't have a whole lot of time and you just want to suggest the forms, think about using, again, the side of the pencil rather than the tip of the pencil. You're not drawing every tree. You're looking very quickly back and forth between the drawing and the reference and trying to make observations about the scale and the placement of dark marks. Really, just try to think about it, think about them abstractly more than anything. And one of the things that you might observe is that this is a ground plane that recedes back into the distance, and so as we move across, the marks get smaller, get tighter together. They're really kind of pushing in. And as you come forward or looking down at a little bit more, they're closer, they're larger. And so in an abstract way, I'm trying to just use my marks to suggest the depth along that ground plane. So make larger marks here in the foreground, and then just smaller, kind of tighter marks as we recede. Very quickly, we go, this is a very small portion of that drawing, and we're very quickly going from large to kind of small. And then we can come in and erase out some of the highlights as well. And so with these shapes, there's kind of like a V shape at the bottom that creates highlight, kind of two trees on either side of it. And then you can kind of come up and create the point of the tree. So it ends up being kind of more of like a diamond shape than anything. But try to hold in your mind, again, you're creating a tree that's a positive space at the top and a negative space at the bottom. And then also, I'm feeling my my instinct come in to create evenly spaced dark marks here, and I have to really force myself to break that habit. Create some variation and really think, and when you look at the reference, where are things more dense? Where are they more open? Actually, I want to just darken this whole area. Emphasize the transition to light along that horizon. And so now that we add these darker values here, it helps contextualize the values here. And so now everything is starting to feel even more and more washed out back there, where before this was established, we were kind of calibrating to that and perhaps seeing them as higher contrast than they actually are. At least that's something that happens to me a lot, that I have to, I'm continually surprised by. Okay. Paul, I like that comment. With your pencils, you can make miracles. That is an awesome suggestion. All right, so these trees here along this hillside are kind of helpful. They cross that barrier. They tie things together, and so I want to place them properly and get their scales, the scale of them right. And so as I'm making those marks, again, I'm using the side of the pencil. So there's this, it's kind of, I'm creating this kind of diamond-like form by kind of pushing upward and diagonally a little bit to create it. So you might have a kind of a horizontal, a vertical mark to kind of orient yourself, and then kind of create that tree shape using these diagonals. And so I want to be careful along that edge too, because again, it wraps around, so there's actually light striking this side of that ground cover, and then it falls into shadow. So what I want to do is, before I lift off any light, I'm creating some of these, that ridge of shadow there, which will hopefully help create that look of light receding, kind of wrapping around that form. So I get a similar thing. I'm not dwelling on it. I'm not really adding the precise details. I'm reacting to the general type of shape and mark that we're seeing. So changing the direction of the marks when I work on that lower ground cover versus then those evergreen trees there. So in this way, we're just really suggesting the land more than anything, not getting bogged down in the details too much. And that's, again, that's just my natural sensibility for this drawing, in part because we're already running pretty long on this drawing. So one of the things that you can kind of do as well is that if you're willing to deviate from the reference photo, you can see the natural tooth of the paper forming, and it's starting to suggest light and shadow on that ground cover. And you can kind of use that to your advantage. So lighter areas become light. The natural tooth of the paper you can darken where it's already getting a little bit darker. So rather than necessarily fighting the tooth, you can kind of use it to your advantage and kind of amplify what's naturally happening on the page. And I think I'm going to do that. I really like this 3B. It's much darker than I thought it would be. So it's a perfect thing for that to happen, for my other pencil to just snap. I broke 2 of them today. Kind of looking at these forms here. So the darker I go here, the lighter, more atmospheric that happens, that becomes back there. All right. And then this is one of the things that it took me a while to really get used to is, I blocked this in as dark, and initially it read as shadow. You come back in with a darker layer on top of that, and all of a sudden that dark now starts to read as light. What I was struggling with in the past is I would see areas that are in light, especially like in this foreground, and my inclination was to make that light, kind of go to the white of the paper and amplify it. The effect of light and shadow actually became stronger as I became more comfortable toning down the lights, especially in the foreground areas, and really thinking about these in terms of zones, right? So this becomes kind of a darker zone. I'm knocking the value relationships down a little bit. This starts to become more of a middle range, and then of course light in that background, and creating real distinctions between those various zones. Because if I make the lights here the same as in here, there's a chance that they're gonna pop together. They're gonna be confusing for the viewer's mind. So this is where block-in stages are really effective. All right. So as I come down in here, there's an overlap between the evergreens and then that ground foliage. And so I can start to then change up the direction of my marks to suggest that. All right. And then, in a way, I kind of like the idea of the light raking across here. So maybe it's a little bit stronger right in here and then flooding out across here. So I'm going to actually come back into this area and darken a little bit more. And I really just want to see what's happening on the page. I'm going to stop when it feels like it represents that ground plane effectively. Make sure there's a visual rhythm to the marks here so that it doesn't flatten out and feeling like just rough. I mean, just an even pattern across there. I'm going to darken down in here. So how is everybody doing? All right, thank you for the comments, Mad Moments Go and Diane. I am happy with this one. This is a I was really nervous for this one, actually. Even though landscapes are generally my thing, I was really worried about getting that sense of light and atmosphere. And I'm feeling like I'm pretty happy with the way it's turning out. I feel like it captures the overall kind of essence of the scene the way I wanted it to. And so as I look down here, we have light striking across the landscape in some of these areas, but it's not competing with the highlights in some of those areas. So the lightest lights, not as light as back in here. So, but it's kind of a bigger range in value. So it goes from fairly light to dark, whereas here it goes from fairly light to a little bit lighter and maybe a little bit darker. So it's a narrower range, and that's what we're talking about with regards to contrast. So generally, atmospheric perspective is created by controlling that contrast, having high contrast areas advance and low contrast areas recede. And not always the case. There's always going to be an exception to that, where some things in the distance have an intense contrast, like a sunset or something like that. But just something to kind of think about as you're going through your drawings here. So again, I'm not really thinking about trees, I'm thinking about shapes, the shapes that the trees make, and I'm trying to replicate those shapes. And in that way, trying to suggest the landscape more than anything. And this is where quick glances can sometimes be more effective. When you look over at the reference photo, target an area, say I'm going to go right to this area, take an instant reaction to the types of shapes I'm seeing, hold that in your mind, and then move over to the drawing to try to execute those. And then as you move back and forth from the reference to the drawing, kind of make adjustments from there. Now there are some areas where I'm going to see what happens if I lift off just in a few areas, if that helps to bring even more life to this. I don't want to go too close to that edge with these lights, but even then I'm not going to go any lighter than the light of the paper. There's just kind of creating some abstract marks that hopefully the viewer's mind will accept, but look beyond, right? If it's not finished enough, then it becomes a distraction. If it's too finished, it could become a distraction, and it could be an indicator to the viewer that something like this is the focal point, but I don't want that to be the focal point. All right, how's everybody doing? I think we're just about done. I could keep kind of fussing with this, but I think overall it's captured the spirit of the scene well. And I never actually used the onyx. That gets really dark too. So I could come back in here and add a few little darks. Just breaking pencils all over the place here. But I hope everybody enjoyed this. Join me again Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to get the time right when I set it up this time, to not confuse everybody who was expecting it to show at 7:45 or something East Coast time. But we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. This is episode 96. You can view all the old episodes at artistnetwork.com. Of course, if you subscribe and set up notifications here on the Artist Network YouTube channel, you'll get notifications when new episodes are set up. What am I doing next week? I am doing, a toucan. I found this really cool photo of a toucan. I haven't drawn a bird in a while, so we'll do that. We're coming up on our 100th episode at the end of this month. Craziness. Can't believe it. Oh, Monica, I just see your comment popped up about what's next week, so hopefully that answered you. All right, so I think this is about it for today. I hope everybody shares their drawing at Artist Network. Again, you can find the link to the show page in the chat there, as well as in the description. Check out these materials. I really enjoy these Legion papers that they shipped out. But and I've heard from some of you that you're really enjoying the cotton rag papers. So I'm glad the camera worked out. That was a little scary when it kind of just shuts off randomly. But it worked. I'm pretty happy with this, but I may keep kind of messing with it a little bit more. But I think you've seen just about everything I can show you today. So I want to thank you all for the great comments, questions, conversation. I can't wait for next week. So have a wonderful weekend, and yeah, I'll see you next week.